look like that.
Obviously, they act like that.
I was just in during rugby race. Thank you. Everybody I was off was just full of rugby.
Oh.
So that was just, but it's just different ages. I was pretty confident.
That's what I wanted.
The shift. Right.
about what this conference is about. Let me start first by welcoming all of you to the Center for African and African American Research. I would also like to thank the supporting staff here, Bernice and Kyla, who have done a great job in hosting this conference. I'm very grateful to them. The nucleus of this project was in November 2010, when some of us who are here today gathered in Malaysia, the University of Malaya, to discuss affirmative action. It was an attempt by us to bring together scholars who have researched the implementation of affirmative action in different parts of the world, both the developed as well as the developing world. And at that conference, we had about 8 academics from the United States, India, Malaysia, South Africa, Fiji, Northern Ireland, and Brazil. Michaeline was there, and I'm very grateful to her because she played a major role as discussant. Our aim at the conference was to review the policy, to review the concept of horizontal inequalities that was introduced by Francis Stewart of Oxford University. The idea of the group dimension and the way in which policy should be constructed. Should it be along group lines or should it be along vertical lines, class lines? We had a lot of problems with some of the arguments that Francis Stewart had made, and so we used affirmative action as our methodology to assess the viability of horizontal inequalities-based policies. I'm happy to say that study has now been published. It was just published this week by Routledge, and the title of the book is Affirmative Action, Ethnicity, and Conflict. But what is also clear at that conference is this. We were discussing that policy at the height of the global financial crisis. And what the global financial crisis clearly indicated to us was the need for us to review neoliberalism carefully. Neoliberalism had been implemented simultaneously with affirmative action. And as much as we were trying to review the pros and cons of affirmative action, we had to situate it within the context of the implementation of neoliberalism. And we also realized one other important thing that it was, the politics of the state, its capture of the state, the deployment of the state to serve vested interests. These were some of the issues which we felt needed far more attention, going way beyond just assessing the viability of the horizontal inequalities approach. I am grateful, and I must say it again, to Michaeline for bringing this idea to Randy. And after much discussion, I'm happy to say that they were both most helpful and supportive. And I'm not saying here only in terms of financial support, but also the ideas behind the core dimensions of this conference comes from our dialogue and building on the conference that we had earlier. Let me say at the outset, we appreciate and value affirmative action. It is a progressive policy. It had to be introduced in many of our countries to rectify important historical social injustices. And the good of affirmative action is that it drew attention to the plight of the long marginalized and the need for social action to rectify these injustices. But when implementing public policies, governments can be extremely pragmatic. They can be extremely eclectic. And when determining the policy direction, and when we look at the state, it is very clear that the state is not neutral. And in that context, we look at the global financial crisis. It was a defining moment. It was a defining moment because it brought to the fore the need for us to now review the way in which we draw our policies and implement them. And defining moments are good. Crises are good because it takes us back to the drawing board. And in this particular case, we can go back and look at history, look at what happened after the Second World War. After the Second World War, we have Germany, which decided that they had to come up with a new model, and they had the social market economy. In Japan, they had the developmental state model. Even in America, they had the New Deal. In Britain, there was a huge debate about the welfare state, the Beveridge Report. So crises can be good. And remember too, that these models also emerged in the post-Great Depression period, where there was a need to revisit the model of economic development. But when we talk about models of development, they're not static, things do change, and there are contestations going on. And while there were people who were promoting a more progressive form of economic development in the post-World War II period, there were others who were opposed to some of these trends. Hayek came up very clearly on this call, and we saw the debate between Hayek and Keynes on this issue. And in the 1970s, as recessions began to eat into the economies of the West, especially Britain, and with the rise of Margaret Thatcher, her hero was Hayek. She herself said, she held up the book, The Road to Serfdom, and she told her ministers, this is the way forward. And we have seen the repercussions of these kinds of models which have been implemented, led by Margaret Thatcher and subsequently by Ronald Reagan. But what is clear is that these policies were not being implemented on its own. There were other models being implemented at the same time. The developmental state in Japan was also being implemented at the time. And look at Japan today. For 4 decades after the Second World War, when the economy was devastated, look at where they were 40 years later. The second largest economy in the world, second only to the United States. An important model of development that even the World Bank was forced to review that policy. And they came up with a volume entitled The East Asian Miracle. It was an important developmental trend because look at the grand modernization and industrialization they brought to East Asia in a period of just 3-4 decades. Unprecedented. But the developmental state that was introduced in Asia was not the same from country to country. Japan had its own model, Korea had its variation, Taiwan had its own variation, Singapore had its own variation, the first runners. The second runners, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, had variations too. And today, we have China. And look at where China is. Does China have a developmental state model? Yes, it does. There are features of it which are there. But it's also a mix of neoliberalism, and you can throw in affirmative action into the pot. And yet, we have to deal with China and what China is doing. But what is also interesting about the developmental state model was, as much as it was an attempt to industrialize these economies and rebuild them, there was no focus on poverty. And yet, they resolved the problem of poverty. They reduced poverty appreciably. And that was one of the most important things about this model. And when we look at this model, then we have to also consider neoliberalism, which emerged around the same time. It was neoliberalism, however, that captured the imagination of many people. And it was a policy that was seen as a common sense policy. But you can see the difference between industrialized Asia and other countries which did not adhere to the developmental state model. And let's just take the case of Latin America or Africa. And look at the social injustices that have occurred in these countries. And what of institutions such as the World Bank and IMF, which adhere to very closely to the neoliberal model. And here we come back again then to the global financial crisis, which brought us back to the drawing board. And the big debate in the post-global financial crisis period is about the role of the state. While neoliberalism called for the retreat of the state, the developmental state model, on the other hand, was about greater state intervention. It seems to me it's a bad word to talk about state intervention, particularly in this country. You saw the debates in the run-up to the presidential elections in the US. A lot of it had to do about the concept of big government versus small government. What is the role of the state? Should the state have ownership and control of the financial sector? What is the role of the state in the post-global financial crisis period? These are important issues that we need to consider as we debate affirmative action over the next 2 days. But there's another issue that we need to discuss and bring to the fore, the issue of democracy. The role of democracy in this developmental model that we are talking about, the role of democracy even in the implementation of affirmative action. And I would argue that one core issue that we need to consider very strongly is the financing of politics. The financing of politics which leads to the capture of the state. And with the capture of the state, it can lead to the capture of other important institutions, including, for example, multilateral institutions such as the World Bank. And what havoc it can bring on developing economies when you have this problem of institutional capture. So recognizing that the state can be extremely pragmatic, recognizing the issue of state capture and institutional capture, we then come to the issue of affirmative action. the issue that we will be debating at length over the next 2 days. The context matters. We have to look at the context of particular histories, the social, economic, and political structures of our respective states, as we do a thoughtful analysis of what's going on here. But there's something else we need to understand. Affirmative action has been implemented for whom? How it's been implemented and for whom? There is one important difference I'd like to bring to the fore here for us to remember. When affirmative action was first introduced in India and the United States, it was for minorities. Subsequently, when it was introduced in Malaysia, followed by Fiji, and then South Africa, affirmative action was for the majority group. In India and in the United States, when affirmative action was introduced, it was for communities that had no political or economic power, completely marginalized. When it was introduced in Fiji, Malaysia, and South Africa, the group that was entitled to affirmative action had political power, but no economic power. These are important differences that we need to discuss. How does this then bear out in the implementation of affirmative action? And then what of the new countries that have just implemented this? Northern Ireland, for business and for employment, and Brazil, the latest entry into this, to implement this policy. So what affirmative action is used for, whether it is for education, employment, or business, needs to be considered very carefully. I feel the focus on business is important, because if you look at Fiji, South Africa, and Malaysia, much emphasis was given to business. That is something which may not be so particular in other countries that we will discuss. But these are issues that have to be discussed in the global financial crisis period. How does affirmative action impair enterprise development? And here I'm reminded of some other important books which we need to consider. Amy Chua, The World on Fire, the academic from Yale University who wrote this important book which irritated the life out of all of us. Because the argument was about market-dominant minorities. The Chinese, for example, in Southeast Asia, the Indians in Africa, and that these market-dominant minorities, because they were minorities and they were so economically powerful, if we had democracy in these parts of the world, then this would lead to conflict. So you cannot have democracy when you have a market-dominant minority. And if that dominant community has political power, this is sure to lead to conflagration. We were extremely upset. Coming from a country, coming from an area where we are exposed to authoritarian rule, this was not what we felt was going on in our countries. And what of the homogeneity of our ethnic communities? Are all Indians the same? Are all Chinese the same? Are all Chinese market-dominant minority group? There are contestations going on from an intra-ethnic perspective too. Indians versus Indians. And what of sub-ethnic identities? The Hokkiens, the Hakkas, the Cantonese, the Malayalis, the Gujaratis. They are not one homogeneous group. There are fundamental differences, but the way the literature has portrayed them as a unified group tackling a dominant, politically powerful group. And should we then sacrifice democracy in this part of the world? Here, when the struggle was for liberation, political liberation. And these kinds of literature come across, and they are captured by the state and held up as models. We are doing it the right way. It was a deeply racialized book. But these then are the issues that we need to grapple with too. When we have to talk about these so-called market-dominant minorities, we have to talk about ownership and control of equity and how it is distributed. We have to look at groups carefully. And we also have to look at other things, such as if we have affirmative action to resolve some of these problems, well and good. But what about the issue of duration? For how long? How long are we going to have these policies? Because where it has been instituted, there's no denying it has brought about great good. But it has also led to numerous problems. The brain drain, the poor investments in the economy, the idea of second-class citizenship, the feelings of marginalization and exclusion. And there's also the issue of access. Who benefits from all this? Are the people who are really entitled to it securing the rents from these concessions that have been created by the state? Or is it leading to new injustices, such as intra-ethnic injustices? These are the issues that we have to discuss. And we have to discuss it also in the context of another key term that has come to the fore. It's in much of the literature, the concept of post-raciality. Are we really living in a post-racial society, or is this just merely a glib sentiment? That it's no reflection of reality. I would argue there is something to be said about post-raciality. I would argue that we need to make a clearer distinction between state and society. I am not saying that society has got it all right. I would argue even in my country that the state may be caught in a time warp. But I think important things are happening within society. And we can see it in electoral trends, not just even in this country, but also in other countries. I hope these issues will be discussed in this conference over the next 2 weeks. Let me end by saying this. This is not the first affirmative action conference that we have hosted. We have been to a few other conferences on affirmative action, and many of them have resulted in extremely heated debates. Very divisive. This is a debate that can divide communities, it can divide us academics. But we would still like to bring this to the fore, because there is something to be said about this very progressive policy and how it's been implemented and how we can get it right, and what should be the way forward. So I hope that will be the spirit in which we will have this discussion, an open, frank debate, but done in good faith. On that note, let me thank you, and I hope all of us will have a wonderful conference. Thank you.
Will our panelists join us?